I adjusted my collar, loosening it a little as I scanned the country club lounge. Sandra was across the room, laughing at something her friend said. A cocktail glass in one hand, her free hand gesturing with the confidence of someone who knew she'd be heard. She looked comfortable, dressed to perfection, like she belonged here among her set of well-heeled socialites. Meanwhile, I felt like a square peg shoved into a round hole, here as her plus one, the one who works with his hands. She spotted me, raised her glass with a wink, then turned right back to her friends. Typical. I'd already worked 10 hours today and was ready to head out, but Sandra had her eye on the latest gossip, the latest name to drop. A minute later, her laugh cut above the crowd. I watched her with a growing, uncomfortable feeling in my gut. She wasn't laughing for her friends. No, she was laughing for Todd Mitchell. The man himself was sitting there, on one of those oversized leather chairs, drink in hand, his posture loose, smug, and cocky. He'd paid me, what, maybe half for that last project? I should have been working on collecting that check, not standing around waiting for Sandra to be ready to leave. But here was Todd, letting Sandra lean close, his hand grazing her shoulder. His voice was low, his eyes half-lidded, and she looked like she was right where she wanted to be. That didn't sit well. I edged closer, close enough to catch their voices, but out of sight from Sandra's watchful friends. "So, how's your next big project going?" she asked, tone breezy. "Oh, it's got all the right hands on deck. Couldn't have picked better people if I tried," Todd replied, shooting her a sideways grin. Sandra laughed, loud and throaty, glancing over her shoulder, as though checking to see if I was still across the room. My jaw clenched. She must have thought I was still buried in some corner, head down like a good, distracted husband. Then her voice dropped a notch. "Honestly, if it wasn't for you, I'd have never known what a good—" She let her words trail off, but her smile said the rest. A thud filled my chest, and I felt my face heat up, a rush of anger boiling right to the surface. The pieces fell together fast. Late nights she'd brushed off, an odd look from a neighbor, a certain smugness in her smile lately. She'd been trying to hide it, but not tonight. I pushed into the circle, catching her mid-laugh. "Evening, folks," I said, catching Todd's eye as his laughter cut off, his smile thinning. Sandra flinched, a quick, nervous look crossing her face before she put on a half-hearted smile. "Jack, didn't know you were still here." Todd gave me a lazy grin. "Jack, good to see you. We were just having a little chat." His eyes held that condescending gleam, a silent reminder that I was just a contractor, the guy working on his place. He hadn't paid me yet, and here he was, with his arm brushing up against my wife like they shared some kind of inside joke. "Chatting, huh?" I said, voice tight. "Would have thought you'd be too busy enjoying that remodel, Todd. Or did you forget there's still an invoice out on it?" His brow lifted, his smile unfazed. "Oh, I thought we'd square that up soon enough. Nice work you did, by the way." "Top notch." Sandra cleared her throat, but I didn't look her way. My focus was all on Todd. "Glad you think so," I said, the words coming slow, controlled. "It'd be a shame if anything went wrong." Sandra's hand touched my arm, a bit too lightly. "Jack, can we talk outside?" Her tone was a low warning. I shrugged off her touch, taking in her wide-eyed look and the faint twitch at the corner of her mouth. "Nah, Sandra, we're done here," I said, my voice cutting through the chatter around us. "We're heading home, now." I didn't drop my gaze, didn't let up on the look I was giving her. For a split second, her face went blank. Then something flickered in her eyes. Annoyance, maybe even a hint of fear. "Jack," she said, keeping her tone low, the edges of a forced smile still clinging there. "You're overreacting. I said we're going." I kept my eyes steady on her, letting that sink in, giving her no room to maneuver. I saw the color rise in her cheeks, but this time, she wasn't flushed from laughter. She pressed her lips together, set her glass down a little too forcefully on the table, then, finally, stood. I could see her friends eyeing us as we walked past, Todd's smug expression in my peripheral vision. I didn't look at him, didn't need to. We left the club in silence, the tension thick between us as we walked out into the night. I led the way to the car, unlocking it without a word, and we both got in, our faces turned toward opposite windows, a gulf between us that had been widening for longer than I'd wanted to admit. The drive home was dead quiet. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the wheel while she stared out her window, shoulders tense, her disappointment almost radiating off her. I didn't care. Not anymore. And if you are curious, she slept in the guest room that night. I met Sandra because of a snowstorm that blew through O'Hare, canceling half the flights on the board and stranding a couple hundred passengers in the terminal. I'd just landed a promising job interview and was stuck in the crowded airport, considering an all-nighter in an uncomfortable plastic seat, when I noticed her by the coffee stand. She was scanning the scene, hands stuffed in her coat pockets, tapping her boot like she was ready to take control of the situation. She didn't have that defeated look everyone else wore. She looked like she had options, like she'd find a way out. It pulled me in. "Another casualty of the snowstorm?" I asked, surprised to hear myself speaking up. She looked me over with a smirk. "More like a hostage," she said, tone dry but playful. One thing led to another, and we grabbed seats together by the gate, swapping stranded passenger horror stories. She was in town for a friend's wedding, a third one this year, she said, rolling her eyes. There was a lightness about her, a quickness to her sarcasm that cracked me up. She told me about the big projects she'd managed as a volunteer, urban art installations, charity fundraisers, the kind of things I'd never thought twice about, but suddenly found myself asking questions about. She made it sound impressive, like a mission. It didn't take long before we were sharing a pack of airport pretzels, and even worse, coffee. She wanted to know about my construction work, why I enjoyed building things. I remember telling her that satisfaction came from seeing the final product standing solid, knowing I'd had a hand in it. I like dependable things, I'd said, and she actually seemed to get it. By morning, we'd split ways, but not before I scribbled my number on a napkin. "In case we're both stuck in another airport," I said. She laughed and slipped it into her coat pocket. She called a few days later, and within weeks, we were coming up with excuses to visit each other. By the end of the year, she'd moved to my city. The idea of us made sense back then. The rock-solid contractor and the lively, ambitious planner. She'd drag me to events I'd never go to, and I'd make her laugh on long drives back home, bringing her back down to earth when things felt too big. We balanced each other, or at least we did for a while. Over time, our differences shifted. I kept working harder to keep up with everything she wanted, the house, the friends, the lifestyle. And she wanted more. More events, more connections, bigger circles. I built a life for her, but eventually, it felt like she was moving past it, and maybe even past me. A few days went by, and the feeling gnawing at me hadn't lessened one bit. The scene at the club, Sandra's laugh, the way she leaned in close to Todd Mitchell, her just a friend defense that stung more than I'd admit, was still sharp in my mind. I'd watched them long enough to know the truth, but that didn't stop me from picking up the phone and dialing Todd's number. He owed me money, a lot of it, and a part of me still hoped maybe I could get some satisfaction the clean way. The line rang twice before he answered, his voice casual. "Hey Jack, what's up?" "Morning, Todd. Just following up on the final payment for your place. Figured I'd give you a heads up before we close out," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Oh yeah, about that," he replied, dragging his words. "Been meaning to get to it, but you know how it is. A few things came up. Give me a week or so and I'll square you up." I knew a brush off when I heard one. "A week, huh?" I said, feeling the frustration build. "Thing is, Todd, my guys already finished the work, all of it, so I expect payment this week." Todd gave a little laugh, the kind meant to sound friendly but only managed to sound dismissive. Sure, Jack, I'll get around to it." The line went dead, and so did my patience. Fine, I thought, gripping the phone a little tighter. I'd make sure Todd paid one way or another, but he'd pay in more ways than he could imagine. And if Sandra happened to be at his side while things came apart, all the better. They could watch it together. A couple of days after that call with Todd, I'd had enough. "I'll get around to it," he'd said, like he was doing me a favor. Sandra's smug look as we'd left the club was etched in my mind too, her eyes daring me to react. But I wasn't taking the bait, not in front of her anyway. I'd give Todd a bill he'd feel in ways he couldn't pay off. So I made a final inspection visit. I called him first, told him I needed to check everything one last time to close out the project. Todd's response was barely a grunt, like he'd already forgotten about it. That was fine. It'd be easier if he didn't even notice. The assistant let me in. I kept it simple, a nod, a few words about looking over the plumbing in the guest kitchen, checking the sprinkler system outside. I made a show of walking through each room as if I were actually inspecting the work. I didn't touch a thing. Yet. I was just getting a feel for it. I noted the water valves, the outdoor sprinkler box, a few hairline cracks on the patio tiles I could use. Small points of attack. Before I left, I set up my first move without even lifting a wrench. All I needed was the name of a guy Todd's landscaper used, the one who maintained his fancy irrigation system. I made a call right there from Todd's kitchen, asking about sprinkler timing issues I'd noticed on another job. Within the hour, a replacement part would be ordered to Todd's system, without a single trace leading back to me. The landscaper would install it, I knew, and the water timer would be off kilter, running at odd hours, leaving the place soaked and sloppy. That was step one. The next day, I planted a second seed, this time without even touching Todd's house. I called one of my old subcontractors, a decent guy who handled gas lines, always trying to upsell extra inspections. I told him I'd noticed a strange smell in a remodeled kitchen and wondered if he had seen that before. "Could be a hairline leak," he replied, his tone thoughtful. "Sometimes those barely show up until they're sealed. Want me to take a look?" "Nah, just wondered," I replied. "But hey, if you ever swing by that area, maybe mention it to the guy. The owner's a bit of a showboat." I knew this would get the message across, casually enough that he wouldn't connect it to me. The next time Todd's place got serviced, I knew the guy would mention it, probably recommend a full check. It'd look legit, sound serious enough to kick off some alarm bells. Todd might have to call for an emergency check, right in the middle of one of his dinner parties if I was lucky. I'd learned the game enough to know that the moment things went south at Todd's place, eyes might wander back to me. So I made sure I was seen, out and about, with plenty of witnesses to back me up if needed. The next few days were busy with back-to-back site visits, all logged with emails and calls. I made a point to respond to every message in real time, adding in a few notes and even checking in with Sandra now and then, keeping things cordial and light. In between, I hit up a few local spots where I knew I'd be remembered. Coffee shops, hardware stores. I stayed visible, making casual small talk with old clients, letting anyone who cared to notice see how busy I was. I left enough of a trail that if someone came snooping later, they'd find a man occupied with work, tied up with projects that left no room for idle hours. Todd's prized wine cellar was next. I called in another favor from a guy I knew, Barry, a temperature control contractor who'd been itching for a referral to Todd's circle. I dropped Todd's name in a conversation, and Barry practically jumped at the chance. When I mentioned that Todd had a minor temp issue, Barry promised he'd make it flawless for Todd's big tasting event. It was a simple adjustment, a half degree off here, a slight shift in airflow there. Todd wouldn't notice a thing until a couple of those prized bottles were spoiled beyond saving. I didn't have to touch a single bottle, but I knew that even a half-degree difference would be enough to ruin wine worth a few thousand. Barry would swear it was perfect, and by the time Todd figured it out, he'd be left blaming his own taste. Finally, I set up my last strike without even stepping foot near his place. Using a random name and a prepaid card, I ordered a batch of open invites to Todd's exclusive event, a night he'd planned meticulously to impress the who's who of his industry. I reworded the invitations to sound like it was a free-for-all bash. Open bar and live music, guests welcome, and made sure they'd land in just the right places. A couple of university bulletin boards, coffee shop counters. This wasn't just a jab at his reputation. It was a way to bring Sandra right into the chaos. She'd be there for every unwelcome guest, every eye that rolled as Todd tried to salvage the event. I knew her need for status would take a hit too, watching her golden boy come apart with every misstep, all while I kept my hands clean. Each piece of this plan fit perfectly, like framing a wall to withstand a storm. Todd's perfect house was on shaky ground, and so was his perfect image. I kept tabs from afar, hearing about the gas inspection that forced guests out early, catching the talk about the mud-soaked lawn, listening to Sandra complain about the strange crowd that crashed their event. By the end of it all, my alibis held strong. No one could link a thing to me. I hadn't left a fingerprint, a footprint, or even a casual remark that could come back. I'd left Todd and Sandra alone in the mess, making them watch as their carefully curated lives began to crumble, each accident timed so they could never quite settle down. Each night, I went home with a kind of satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. This was only the beginning. You might be wondering why my wife spent so much time with Todd, at his events, by his side. Believe me, it wasn't like I hadn't asked her to cut back. I brought it up more than once, thinking maybe we could save what was left of our marriage if she'd just step away from him. But even then, I think we both knew it was already too late, that the end was coming one way or another. We'd been coasting for a long time, just running out the clock, and she knew it as much as I did. Sandra had grown restless years back. Leaning on me for financial security wasn't enough anymore. She craved independence, a piece of life with a little more shine and status. My steady contracting business paid the bills, but it didn't offer her the lifestyle she thought she deserved. Then along came Todd. They met at one of her social events, a fundraiser if I remember right, and something clicked. Todd was impressed by Sandra's ambition, her drive. Where I saw a woman getting tangled up in the wrong crowd, he saw potential. And so, he gave her an opportunity, a chance to work alongside him, managing high-end events for his clients. She'd use her organization skills and charm to throw exclusive parties, charity events, high-profile gatherings, anything that would showcase Todd's properties and keep him in the good graces of his rich clients. At first, her involvement was small, just a few events here and there, the occasional luncheon or networking dinner. But as the months went by, Sandra's role grew. She became more than just an event planner. She was his right hand, handling everything from investor relations to managing Todd's entire social image. Officially, she became a partner in his business, complete with a title, a new office, and all the status she'd been craving. She was finally getting the life she'd convinced herself she deserved, a life far removed from what I could ever offer. Her reasons for sticking by him weren't just about romance. Sure, Todd had charm, and he wore his power like a custom-tailored suit, but Sandra's reasons went deeper than attraction. She had something real invested in Todd's business now, a financial stake that tied her to his success. If Todd's business took a hit, so would her freedom, her entire reputation. Every event she threw was another step towards solidifying her name in that exclusive circle she wanted so badly to be part of. Leaving Todd, giving up what she'd built, meant going right back to where she started. The money, the reputation, the access to all the right people. Sandra had fought her way into that world and wouldn't let go, not even if it meant watching Todd's life fall apart in public. The fallout from my first few moves rolled in exactly as I'd planned, but it was just the beginning. Todd was feeling pressure, but it wasn't enough yet. The trick to a plan like this? Patience. One steady blow after another, each hitting a little harder, each one harder to ignore. Todd had this way of walking around like he'd never broken a sweat in his life. That image of his was the foundation of his little empire, the confidence that kept people throwing money at him, thinking he'd make it multiply. So, I aimed to show just how fragile that confidence was, one small incident at a time. I started with his properties, places where his tenants could feel the consequences directly. They were his biggest clients, and they'd built up his reputation almost as much as his big-shot personality had. I knew exactly how to chip away at it. One of his luxury apartment complexes was my first target. I tipped off a friend in building maintenance, someone Todd had actually hired in the past, mentioning that I'd heard a rumor about flickering lights and faulty outlets. Within a week, residents started reporting electrical issues. Lights dimmed and buzzed, elevators stopped on random floors, and Todd's staff was scrambling. All that glamour, all that high-end polish he bragged about, made to look like cheap, slapped-together junk. The complaints started trickling up to Todd's investors, and soon enough, he was down there in person, trying to smooth things over with a forced grin. Each new complaint chipped away at his reputation. But the beauty of it, no one could blame a specific person, just unforeseen issues, routine problems, things a competent manager should have handled easily. With each sabotage, Todd's reputation was peeling away layer by layer, but I needed something more personal, a real hit to his precious mansion, his pride and joy. I'd already used up my contacts for the small stuff, and I couldn't risk looping in anyone else. This one had to come from me. The plan was straightforward. Screw up his water pump system to make sure it malfunctions at the most inconvenient time. Todd's property had a complex pump setup, one for his pool, one for the lawn, and another that connected to his basement drainage system. I knew just how to tweak it to cause chaos in every part of his house. So, I went in after dark, choosing a night when I knew Todd would be out at some industry gala. The timing was perfect, and I'd parked a good block away to avoid being seen anywhere near his place. I slipped around the back gate, careful of the motion sensor by the door, and headed straight for the pump room in his basement. It was dark, the basement only lit by a weak emergency light. I crouched by the main water pump, making a few adjustments to the pressure valve. Nothing drastic, just enough to build over time. In a week or so, the whole thing would burst, sending a flood into the basement that'd take Todd days to clean up. By then, I'd be nowhere near the place. Just as I finished tightening the last screw, I heard it, the unmistakable rumble of a car pulling up outside. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but I still had my wrench in hand, evidence plain as day. I stuffed the wrench into my bag and ducked behind the boiler, pressing myself into the shadows just as footsteps sounded above. It wasn't Todd. I could tell by the voice. It was his assistant, probably sent back to pick something up. The footsteps grew louder as he moved from room to room, muttering to himself, clearly not in any rush. I held my breath, steadying my nerves. I was in a corner, and if he decided to come into the pump room, he'd see me in seconds. My mind raced with options, each one riskier than the last. Just then, I heard the footsteps pause, and then a door close somewhere upstairs. The assistant's voice faded as he left, the front door clicking shut behind him. I let out a slow breath, waited another minute just to be sure, then made my way back up and out, careful not to leave a single trace. As soon as I hit the street, I ducked into a side alley, my heart pounding, my pulse roaring in my ears. By the time I was back in my car, I'd almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Here I was, a guy who'd never been late on a job or left a detail unchecked, risking everything to sabotage a water pump like I was in some thriller movie. But it was worth it. Todd's carefully managed life was about to drown, and I'd made sure I was the one holding the wrench. Sure enough, a week later, Todd was hosting another gathering, and that wall picked just the right moment to burst. His guests had barely settled in when the sound of rushing water had them jumping up from their cocktails. People scrambled, trying not to get their designer shoes soaked. And Sandra? She'd been in the middle of a conversation with some high-end client of Todd's, trying to network her way up as usual. I pictured her, tight-lipped and humiliated, while her carefully constructed world got a little more waterlogged. I felt a growing sense of satisfaction, the kind of satisfaction that sticks with you long after the moment passes. Watching Todd scramble, watching Sandra's plans unravel as fast as she'd stitched them together, gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of control, of long overdue justice. There was no guilt, no second guessing. I saw it as balancing the scales. Todd was the kind who'd let someone else carry the weight, and Sandra had chosen her side. My actions weren't petty, I told myself. They were justice served cold, with a steady hand. And with each step, each carefully laid trap, I felt something in me harden, a shift I couldn't deny. I'd always been the one who worked hard, played fair, who made sure every job was done right. Now, for once, I was bending the rules, but it felt fair. It felt earned. The last few weeks had been a roller coaster. Sandra had gone from bragging about her new life and business wins to whispering about her frustrations to anyone who'd listen. And by now, she was barely keeping it together. She cried at night, thinking I couldn't hear her. And the worst part was she blamed everyone but herself. The plans she and Todd had pieced together so confidently had started to crack, and no amount of late-night apologies could save it. We'd agreed on a divorce in principle, just waiting to finalize the paperwork with our lawyers. But I wasn't done, not by a long shot. Todd wasn't about to walk away unscathed. I didn't have any proof Todd and Sandra had ever slept together, not solid evidence. But I didn't need it. A man can sense things, see them, even when they aren't right in front of him. And in my gut, I knew. Maybe that's what justified it all for me, knowing the truth, even if I couldn't see it laid out on paper. But my revenge wouldn't need rumors or subtle sabotage anymore. I was going to make this loud. For this last move, I ditched the quiet tricks. No more valves or hidden timers. Instead, I turned to the kind of exposure you can't fix with a toolkit. I'd heard whispers from clients about Todd's questionable business practices, unpaid vendors, corner cutting and property management, the kind of rumors that destroy a reputation when they're laid bare. And Sandra? She'd get dragged right into the spotlight with him. I called up a journalist I knew was hungry for a local scandal, one of those hard-hitting types who loved the takedown. I told her I had a story that could shake up her career. Just give me 5 minutes to lay it out, I told her. and she was on board before I'd even started talking. This was no longer about taking Todd down alone. It was about revealing the kind of people they really were, Sandra included. I spent days digging up every scrap of proof I could find. I combed through old emails, invoices, anything from my business that had crossed paths with Todd's shady deals. I'd heard about the complaints from his tenants, so I got in touch with a few of them, quietly asking if they'd ever had issues. Some of them spilled details without a second thought, eager to tell me about the poor maintenance, broken promises, and unpaid dues Todd had been sweeping under the rug. A couple of them were even willing to go on record. I made copies of everything. Photos of his shoddy properties, letters from unpaid subcontractors, a list of public complaints from his tenants. Each one was like a nail in Todd's coffin, a piece of evidence that painted a picture of a man who'd run his business like a personal cash cow. And with Sandra attached to his side as a partner, she'd go down with him. The journalist was ready. She'd scheduled an entire column for it. All I had to do was wait for her to pull the trigger. When the article dropped, it hit like a bomb. The headline was ruthless. Beneath the glamour, the real face of Todd Mitchell's real estate empire. The article laid it all out. Todd's unpaid workers, the fraudulent reports, the investors who'd lost faith, and the tenants who'd been taken for a ride. My stomach twisted as I watched it spread. But it wasn't guilt. No, it was satisfaction. Todd's name was trending for all the wrong reasons, and he couldn't hide from this. Sandra? She got her fair share too. The article didn't hold back on naming her as Todd's business partner. Every scandal, every shady deal was tied to her as well. By the time the press got a hold of her, she was splashed across every headline next to Todd, each one cementing her as complicit. Her so-called reputation was now a public spectacle, all her carefully built status unraveling in real time. I knew things had truly hit the mark when I saw a photo of Todd in the paper, looking ragged and haggard, flanked by reporters and dodging questions. And Sandra? She was right behind him, forced to stand by as her entire world turned on her. Exposed as a fraud, just another pawn in Todd's crumbling game. Todd's investors were the first to pull the plug. The fallout was fast and brutal. With every angry phone call, every lawyer's letter, Todd's empire took another hit. Some of his biggest clients dropped him overnight, pulling their contracts and leaving his real estate empire hanging by a thread. Lawsuits were on the horizon, some from his own tenants and others from vendors he'd stiffed. The reckoning he'd never thought would come was now breathing down his neck. Sandra, the ever-loyal partner, tried to defend him, even as her own name got dragged through the mud. But it didn't matter. The journalists published follow-up pieces, each one worse than the last, until every trace of their success was smeared with scandal. Sandra's status circles, the elite social events she used to love, turned their backs on her. I heard she tried to salvage her connections, but no one wanted to be associated with her anymore, not after the media frenzy had exposed them both. It was beautiful in a twisted way, watching from the sidelines. They'd wanted a life of high society, endless admiration, wealth at any cost. And now they had it. All the wrong kind of attention. All the wrong kind of fame. I won't pretend it didn't feel good. I'd wanted revenge, and I got it. But in the end, it was more than just payback. It was about reclaiming something of my own. I'd started out angry, desperate to make them pay. But somewhere in the middle, I'd realized that wasn't enough. I needed to lay it all out there. No more sneaking around in the shadows. I was done letting them take up space in my life. Life after the dust settled wasn't luxurious, but it was enough. I got the rest of what Todd owed me, through the court, of course. By then, Todd was a wreck, scrambling to cover his debts and legal fees. Mine wasn't the only case he was fighting either. To keep up with it all, he had to sell off his properties, most of them at half the price he'd planned on, just to keep his head above water. Funny enough, some of those places ended up in the hands of new owners who needed a solid contractor. I struck a few deals, and before long, I was back working on properties I'd once sabotaged, this time to build them up instead of tear them down. It felt right, like things had finally come full circle. I'm still on my own, but I'm all right with that. If life's taught me anything, it's that patience pays off. The right things come along when they're meant to. And if there's a moral to this story, it's simple. Don't screw around with another man's wife, especially if that man knows how to screw around with pipes. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, comment, and hit that subscribe button for more of Love, Lust, Lies.